This video is sponsored by Ren.
When we think of the word punk, we probably think of punk rock music. I grew up on punk rock music, it meant a lot to me and it still does. But music isn't the only space where punk exists. Punk, as a concept, can be found across all mediums of entertainment, all forms of artwork, and all aspects of our society. And so I want to talk today about punk literature, and what I think punk literature is. But do you know what else is punk? Looking after the environment, which is why I want to thank today's sponsor, Ren. Ren is a simple and effective way to make a difference in the climate crisis. Ren is a website where you can calculate your carbon footprint and then offset it by funding a diverse mix of carbon reduction projects, like tree planting, mineral weathering, and rainforest protection. By answering a few questions about your lifestyle, you can find out your own carbon footprint and learn how to reduce it. No one can reduce their carbon footprint to zero, so you can offset what you have left after reducing it. Once you sign up to make a monthly contribution to offset your carbon footprint, you receive monthly updates from the projects that you support. You get to see what your money is being spent on, with photos and details on every tree planted, every acre reforested, every ton of carbon offset. Since I live in the UK and I take a lot of pride in the natural landscape of Scotland, I am very invested in the Mineral Weathering in Scotland project. The organisation behind this project is called the Future Forest Company, and they were formed to sequester as much carbon as possible in forest land. They buy degraded, unloved land and reforest and restore it back to health, using agroforestry methods including rotational grazing of livestock and recycling forest waste into biochar. By visiting Ren's website, you can check out which projects are currently being funded. And the first 100 people who sign up using the link in the description of this video will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. Thank you so much to Ren for sponsoring this video. Check out the link in the description. And now let's talk about punk music, and punk literature, and everything punk. Defining the concept of punk can be quite difficult. Generally, it means a rebellion against normativity, rebellion against conservatism. I still don't know if it's conservatism or conservativism. I'm never going to look it up. It's a rebellion against unfairness. It's a rebellion against unjustness. Punk is about fighting for minorities. It's about fighting for what is right and what is good and what should be. Punk is a big thing. It's a big concept. Punk represents anyone who is not part of a majority. Punk is about being angry at unfairness and injustice. And punk is usually something that's seen as grassroots, something that starts small, starts with no money, no support, just a sense of what is right and what should be, and someone trying to find a voice and a way to express injustice. If you look at the history of punk rock music, it has always been intensely political. In fact, if music isn't being explicitly political, I don't think it's punk. Punk music also has a style and a sound. There might be fashion tied to it. You might expect punk songs to be short and sometimes played without much skill, but none of that has to be true. That's really not what punk is. One of my favourite modern bands is a British metal band called Architects, who are very, very technically impressive songwriters and musicians. They're a metal band, but they are absolutely punk, because their music is intensely political. Very specific songs about specific politicians, policies, aspects of injustice in our society. All of that is punk, therefore Architects are a punk band in my opinion. Now, when it comes to literature, all of this same stuff applies. I talk a lot about books that I read being punk. But it's so hard to define that, and that's really what I want to do here, if possible. When I call a piece of literature punk, what I'm doing is arguing that it is a piece of literature bolstered by righteous indignation, passion for something that is related to politics, economics, social dynamics, people's rights, all of these things. This is all punk. And I do also think that there is a tone and style as well. If a piece of literature makes you feel kind of uncomfortable because it tackles difficult themes or it broaches taboo topics, there's also something punk in that, because there is a willingness to be daring, to upset people. And when I say upset people, I do not mean in a Ricky Gervais sense where you punch down at minorities. I mean the exact opposite of that. Making people upset means making conservatives upset because you're doing something that breaks away from their expectations, the typical mold, heteronormativity, Christian conservatism, all of these status quo things should be upset. It is about reframing things. It is about tipping the balance. And that's why all feminist literature is punk, because it's doing something to upset the male majority, to upset power dynamics. Pretty much all literature that is written by black writers that has blackness tied into it is punk. And of course that also goes for most of the literature that I ingest these days, which is queer literature. Queer literature is punk because queer people have been and are still fighting for our rights in countries all across the world, all of the time, every single day. And every single time a queer writer writes a book about queerness, it is an act of rebellion. It is an act of standing up and declaring that you exist and you have a right to exist, therefore you are being punk. So if you read something like 100 Boyfriends by Brontez Purnell, that is a funny, explicit, sexy, awkward, wonderful collection of stories about gay sex and gay romance. It's punk. It's punk in part because of how explicit it is, and that's going to upset some people, some straight white conservatives. But it's not just about that. If you're only doing that, it's kind of childish and kind of limp. You're also trying to reframe sexual normativity and make people realize that gay sex is beautiful and funny and awkward, just like straight sex is. And so there is a political motivation behind these stories. And then some of my favourite books of the last few years are very explicitly punk because, again, they have this tone. They include elements and details that are frightening. Something like Alison Rumfitt's Tell Me I'm Worthless, Sayaka Murata's Earthlings, Melissa Broder's The Pisces or Milk-Fed. These are all books that are in some way queer, feminist, about ethnic minorities, and all of these things are punk because all of these people are parts of minority groups who have to fight for their rights. And they do so through art and literature. And I would argue that that makes all of this stuff punk. And I think the rawness of literature also has a part to play. And that's why I love and support indie publishers. Indie publishers, by their very definition, are punk. In part because they often take on manuscripts and writers who might be passed over by bigger publishers because they are too risky, they are too strange, they are too experimental. They are doing something that perhaps doesn't fit with what typical readers expect. Maybe their book is written in a style that is tough to get into. Maybe the book is too short to be put on the shelves of Smiths. There's all sorts of reasons. And quite often, indie publishers deal with specific groups of people. You have feminist publishers, queer publishers, and in that they are punk. They are also grassroots. They also work from nothing, from the ground up. An entire publishing house can be run by one or two people, and those people are hanging on by a shoestring with the support of community. And that in itself is the most punk thing. Community and punk go together hand in hand. Punk has always been about small, intimate communities working together and fighting for one another. And that's something that kind of bugs me about online discourse. Sometimes you see people get angry at punk musicians for speaking out against politics. There are some hilarious tweets out there where Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine has had to get into arguments with fans who didn't realize he was political. Rage Against the Machine. They don't even think about the name. It's incredible. And so punk is inherently pro-human rights. Anyone who listens to punk music and is sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, they are not punk. Kurt Cobain used to write and say, if you are homophobic, racist, sexist, transphobic, etc., do not listen to our music, do not buy our music, do not come to our shows. Because punk is inherently for everyone, especially people who are still fighting for their human rights. That's what punk is about. And that's what I mean when I talk about punk literature. If punk literature is feminist, if it is about fighting for rights in some way, if it is about promoting a minority group and their culture and their experiences, it's punk. And especially if it is being published by a small publisher who have taken a chance on a small unknown writer, and it's always small communities that love these things. It's always small communities that go to punk shows and watch punk bands sing about Tories, sing about Margaret Thatcher, sing about Section 28. And it's exactly the same in the literature circle. You are supporting small publishers, small presses, who have something to say, who have a manifesto, and are publishing authors who are doing exactly the same. And as I said, I will sometimes call a book punk based on its tone or the events that happen within the novel, and I think Sayaka Murata's Earthlings is the best example of this. Sayaka Murata is a punk Japanese author. Her books are experimental, they are frightening, they are meant to shock you, especially Earthlings is the best example. It is meant to frighten you. Because Earthlings is about a young woman who does not fit into society. She is a puzzle piece that does not fit the jigsaw. And so, to express the concept of not fitting into society and not being able to function as part of it, in terms of work, social life, economics, living day to day, she expresses that through the concept of taboo, the idea that a person breaks these taboos and therefore lives outside of society. It is incredibly punk, it's frightening, it's shocking, it's upsetting, and Earthlings has stayed with me for that reason. It shocked and upset me. But it didn't upset my sensibilities. It made me feel a little gross physically, but it made me think about its themes so much more because of that. It's not a book that is encouraging anything. It's a book that is making you think, why? Why did it do something so shocking? What does it want to say? And so you sit with it and you think and you think and you think. And the idea of doing something so frightening and powerful and risky in your writing is inherently punk. And this is something that I generally find frustrating, is people seem to not be able to tell the difference between saying and doing shocking things that are punching down at women, at ethnic minorities, at queer people, whatever. They don't seem to know the difference between that and something that is considered perhaps what Terry Pratchett defined as satire, which is holding powerful people to account, essentially, through comedy, or just poking fun at the status quo and how ridiculous it is. Or poking fun at yourself and making people laugh with you rather than at you. That's also very punk. And comedy can be very punk. And there's nothing less punk than comedians like Ricky Gervais. I have a lot of feelings, a lot of thoughts about punkness, so I think I'll stop here. But I wanted to try to define the concept of punk literature and why it's so important to me. This is why I support queer writers, books in translation, translators themselves, and indie publishers. All of this to me is punk, because it's all part of minority groups, smaller groups, people who get overlooked, people whose books never get a chance. We as a society do not read enough women, enough writers of colour, enough books in translation, enough queer writers, and that needs to change. And moving and fighting and encouraging people to do that is a punk movement. So read more punk books. Read books that, by the definitions I've laid out in this video, are punk. And again, thank you to Ren for sponsoring this video. It's so cool that I finally got my first sponsor. I really appreciate that. Ren is incredible. Check out the link in the description and subscribe for books.